That was a funny comment. I didn't mean to hear it, but.
Thank you so much, and the first panel certainly lived up to billing, so to speak, and we're so grateful for everyone for being here and sharing their wisdom. Our second panel is going to focus on Native peoples and constitutions. Before I introduce the moderator, I do want to remind you that there's going to be a reception at the Montana Historical Society starting at 5. And that reception will go from 5 to 7. It's going to be a relaxed affair, is the way that the director described it to me. Meaning you won't have to listen to me talk or something like that. You get to just go. And the constitutions will be on display, I'll mention again, on the second floor of the Historical Society, so well worth doing. And then again at 7:30 this evening, back here in this room, we will have a conversation focused on free enterprise and what were the founders thinking. So please join us for that. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Ray Cross, who will serve as the moderator for this panel. And Ray is a graduate of Stanford University and Yale Law School. He has taught law at the University of Montana School of Law since 1993. He is a member of the 3 affiliated tribes, the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation, of the Fort Berthold, I hope I pronounced that correctly, Indian Reservation. And Ray will introduce his conversationalists. Please join me in welcoming Ray on this panel.
First of all, I want to say that my hat's off to Ken and his staff for organizing such a wonderful 40th anniversary event. So thank you, Ken. Thank you to your staff. I'd like to just briefly introduce them. They're going to make additional comments as they speak. I'd like to introduce our 2 panelists. First, on my far right, is Danna Jackson. I've known Danna for going on 20 years now. She was one of my law students. She went on to do even bigger and better things. She worked in D.C., staffer for Tim Johnson, senator from South Dakota, and now she's on the staff of the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Montana. I hope I got all of that right. To my immediate right is Gloria Earth-Highley, and I just had the pleasure of meeting her today. She's a member of the Assiniboine Sioux tribe from Fort Peck out east from here, and she does, among other things, aside from being a really strong supporter of the Girl Scouts. We talked about our Girl Scout crew for a while, and the conspiracy with Girl Scout cookies, that sort of thing. And she's also an interpreter, a native interpreter for Nevada City, so she has a lot of these skills that we need on this panel. I'd like to kind of briefly lay out, in light of the sort of sweeping topic we're supposed to cover in an hour or so, Native people and constitutions. And I thought it was an interesting choice I mentioned to Ken. And here's what I discovered. He wants us to sort of put the status of Native peoples in a sort of comparative context, not simply the Montana Constitution, the United States Constitution, and perhaps Native peoples in countries like ours, the so-called 4 settler English nations. If you look around the world, there was a big reach of Britain, and there's 4 English settler nations with substantial native populations. That's Australia with the Aboriginal populations, that's New Zealand with the Maori populations, Canada with the First Nations people, and of course the Indian people, somewhat a misnomer of the United States. So we'll speak a bit about the unique relationship between constitutions and Native peoples. And we'll also talk about a unique topic that isn't addressed very often, and I've asked Danna, who's volunteered to talk about this, the role of what's called tribal constitutions. Those came on board really as part of Indian reform under the College administration, 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act, Indians too now have constitutions. At least most of them do, some do elect to participate. I'd like to, if we can't answer any questions that you have, I'd like to refer you some very good material out of the Indian Education for All desk. Indians 101, all of the questions you were afraid to ask, or at least ask us. Secondly, some very nice artwork promoting which I think is the high watermark of success for Indian people of the 1972 Montana Constitution. It's called Indian Education for All. And it's a legislative, executive undertaking to really bring to life the Indian education provision of Section 10 of the Montana Constitution. Too many people bear credit for getting this done. Lawsuits, litigation, legislative, executive action, it all came into being. So we have these nice brochures showing that it's in being finally. So I'd like to mention just a couple of things that may be helpful to you in understanding the status of Native peoples under constitutions. First of all, Indian people, Native people's rights don't derive from constitutions. That's sort of an odd saying because in modern thinking, Enlightenment thinking, the set of political rights, what you see is what you get with the Constitution. We're creatures, in a sense, of a very important document called the United States Constitution that sets out in very positive law terms a set of rights and of responsibilities that define us as members of a body politic called the United States. The United States was the first written modern constitution. You look back, England doesn't have a constitution. When you ask Englishmen, what's their constitution? Why don't you have a written constitution? As I did in British constitutional theory course, they say, darn it, we don't need a constitution like you Yanks. Our constitution is engraved on our hearts. But we're not as good as Englishmen. We need a written constitution so we can argue about it, litigate, complain. That's what these constitutional conventions are about. Indians, their rights, natives' rights, largely are what you call inherent. That's a product of thinking, of the Enlightenment, thinking that Indians predated the United States, their rights predate the United States, they're inherent in nature, they're aboriginal in nature. So when you talk about Indians, you're going to find there's a big disconnect between any constitution, certainly modern constitution and Indians. It doesn't answer all of the questions, that's why you have pamphlets out on the desk. So I'd like to just have you understand the interrelationship between all of the constitutions, the set of positive rights they create that define us as legal and political beings as part of the United States. Some people think there's too many rights, some people think there's too few rights, but the only place you find those rights is in a written constitution. That's the four corners. That's the sideboards of what you can argue about. You can argue about natural law till you're blue in the face. No judge in the United States will listen to you unless you can locate it somewhere in this document. Okay? Indians don't argue over that. They argue over things very different. They're more like the Englishmen. They say, our Constitution isn't here, it's in our hearts. That's how we know we have those rights. Our Creator gave them to us. We don't need an intermediary. Right? So let's think about that. So I'd like to just start off with who are the Native people. And one of the things is that the Indian people, in a sense, were not part of America for a long, long time. They weren't citizens of the United States until very late in our nation's history. So there was no reason to argue for them about the Constitution. It didn't have the relevance that it may have otherwise. Indians, according to Supreme Court law, couldn't, by self-help, become citizens. They're not like even illegal aliens who, if they're born on this soil, by what's called birthright citizenship, quite controversial now with the debate over immigration, they have the full set of citizenship right as you would be. Indians could not become citizens. They were classified in their homelands as domestic aliens. There had to be a positive law act called the Naturalization Act that conferred as a political recognition by Congress citizenship status. That did not happen until 1924. So when you think about this, a lot of the questions that revolve around constitutions don't speak directly to Indians. Indians are barely mentioned in the U.S. Constitution, not really mentioned at all in the 1889 Montana Constitution, unless you consider what's called the disclaimer provision that the United States had, Montana agreed to become a union member. So let's start with this discussion. I'd like to ask Danna first to just talk a bit about what she's seen